Okay.
Okay, I think we're live. Kia ora koutou. If you could just remember to mute your mics, would be much appreciated. Yeah, hopefully you can enjoy the various presentations that we've got for you this evening. Tēnei te mihi mai o ha, nau mai hara mai koutou. Roto te o ngā
Is that on Wi-Fi or dial-in?
I didn't get that screen.
To hear others, please join audio.
I didn't get that screen.
Kia ora koutou. Not sure how much of that you got, but if you can mute your mics, that would be great. My name's Manu Keddy, based in Tairāwhiti, just north of Māhia. Welcome along, everybody. And if you can remember to mute your mics, that would be great. I've been helping out RocketLab, researching some of the issues around, helping out RocketLab Monitor, not RocketLab, researching some of the issues around the site, what happened to get the site there, what's been going on since, and also some of the connections that RocketLab has with their clients and with the government in New Zealand and other governments overseas. Together with Sonia Smith and a group of others based in Māhia, Nuhaka, Wairoa area, we've been trying to just understand and share what information we can provide. So this is another opportunity to share a bit more information. I'll hand over to Sonia shortly, but before I do, thought it might be useful to have a little backgrounder on the issues. And after Sonia, we'll have Kevin Clements and also a notice from Laurie Ross about an event coming up in a week or so. So perhaps if we can get the slides going.
Oh my.
Is it you?
Oh, I got 2 minutes.
What?
Something good.
I'll take it. Your word on that one.
Can we see the slideshow? I can't. Oh, here we go. Few technical issues as we. Awesome. Thanks, Eliana. And to Auckland Peace Action for helping in many ways with this. So we'll just here very quickly go through for those that need a bit of a background to RocketLab. And we'll go to the next slide. So yeah, founded in 2006 in New Zealand by Peter Beck and Mark Rocket, who changed his name to Rocket and has since left the company. Certainly not the first missile targeting technology company in New Zealand. 2005, the year before RocketLab was founded, Raycon, which is a much older New Zealand company, admitted that, or one of its senior executives said publicly that its components were used in smart bombs and for missiles. Pretty quickly after that, the company tried to retract that statement and say they weren't sure where those components end up and it's none of their business. even though it is their core part of their business. So it's New Zealand's got a bit of a history of some of this similar technology being used offshore. And of course, the government loves it. It's been a poster child company for both national and Labour-led governments. It's won a number of New Zealand Trade and Enterprise Awards and grants, along with, so has Raycon. So these sort of, rocket science type companies are very popular with the politicians and seem to attract a lot of government support. And they had many promises of jobs, of course, in Wairoa that may not have eventuated in the way that others were perhaps expecting. They're mostly owned in the US. Silicon Valley venture capital funds are the largest investors as far as we know. Also, Lockheed Martin has a decent stake, and they're the world's largest weapons supplier, manufacturer. And in New Zealand, we have investors like Sir Stephen Tyndall's K1W1 and ACC were also early investors in RocketLab. And just about to, they've been planning to do this listing process through another company to go on to the stock exchange in North America. Next slide. This was an interesting quote from Peter Beck back in 2008 in an interview with Metro magazine. He said, hey, it always comes back to the military in this game. So from very early on, he was pretty clear that the military clients were going to be a core part of what would make this company happen. And there's a few rumors around with Mark Rocket, the other co-founder, as to why he left. And some unverified rumors were that part of it was to do with the ethics of the clients that were being served, but totally unfounded or unverified rumors about that. But yeah, so very clear from early on that there was going to be military involvement. Next slide. So from what we've been able to gather, what RocketLab has acknowledged, and when you sort of start going down some of these rabbit holes, it's pretty clear that RocketLab does serve weapons manufacturers and military clients. Most of them are from the US, but there's also been customers from Germany and Australia and probably further afield. Most of them are either companies or actually US government agencies connected to the military. And the targeting systems that RocketLab deploys, while they say they're developmental, they haven't actually been used in combat. It's all about developing greater capability for their clients. It's understood that these technologies can be used for both conventional and for nuclear weapons. So New Zealand's pretty clear on its nuclear-free legislation, and there's some questions over whether this activity is consistent with that nuclear-free stance that New Zealand's had for a long time, because this technology is able to be switched very quickly from one missile to another, and that may have a nuclear warhead. A lot of people said, well, these guys aren't launching weapons, but a bit like a rifle with a scope. Essentially, the satellites, the technology is like a scope on a rifle that determines where the munitions will end up. And so a rifle without a scope these days isn't that useful. Likewise, these missiles without technology to direct them where they need to go aren't that great either. RocketLab, as we know, has got its first launch site at Māhia. And if you read the North and South article, you'll see that via Pauline she hosted Peter Beck when he was coming around to see if Māhia could be used, made some promises, according to her, that it would not be used for military purposes. She spent her life campaigning against weapons and and is very upset about the revelations that they are in fact serving military clients. They've got a long-term lease that was negotiated for the launch site, and as we understand it, only the trustees of the Māori Land Corporation were involved in that decision. The wider shareholding whānau didn't get consulted. Some of the neighbours did get consulted, and there's a short list of those people who were consulted in the consent issued by Wairoa District Council. And those went through very quickly, and the Wairoa District Council Māori Liaison Officer said, don't worry about consulting wider with Māori, generally they support it, which was totally untested and, as it turns out, fairly unfounded claim to be making. And of course there's a lot of local opposition now that's evident in some of these activities, and whānau will talk to that shortly. Carry on. Keep going. So yeah, some pretty strong feelings at Māhia at the moment. So just quickly, it's actually a fairly simple piece of legislation. If anyone wants to have a look at the Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Act, that was passed 2017 and is due for review this year. One of the things we're really pushing hard for is that the New Zealand public should have a say on that review, so that we can have some more input to it. There's a set of cabinet principles around the kinds of payloads that can be launched, but the wording in those principles is fairly woolly, and you could drive a bus or a rocket through them. And they talk about things like not being allowed to launch payloads that could damage space infrastructure in space or on Earth, but it doesn't talk about the possibility of damaging or destroying people on Earth. Also, the environment is protected, but again, people are not. So there's some issues that we'd like to work through with government on those principles, I think. And New Zealand also recently signed the Artemis Accords, which ostensibly commit all parties to peaceful exploration and use of space. But again, it's pretty clear that most of the major powers are rushing very quickly into the space race to weaponize space as quickly as possible. Those are the ministers that are responsible. So what can we do? The other presenters will talk some more to that, but encourage people to stay informed, get more informed, share the information with your friends and family and workmates and neighbours. Do contact politicians, it does work. And I think there's many peace activists who are involved in the anti-nuclear movement who can attest to the power of continuing to raise our voice with the decision makers so that they understand there's significant concerns from public. Participate in the actions. Laurie will talk about one that's coming up, and the Māhia locals will talk about there's ongoing actions planned around each launch, as I understand, so some opportunities for people to support there. And then there's just a bunch of organisations, peace organisations that have been doing great things for many years and are also concerned about this issue that you can get in behind and support. If you want to keep in touch, visit RocketLabMonitor.com, and we've got a mailing list that gets regular newsletters. So that was a very brief introduction, and I'll now hand over to Sonia and whānau at Māhia. Kia ora.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ko Sonia Smith tōku ingoa, no nui haka hau, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So yeah, my name's Sonia Smith. I am alongside of Manu, one of the unmute?
Yes.
So, yeah, one of the organisers for RocketLab Monitor. So I've got whakapapa or kinship to rongo mai wahine, that iwi there, but I don't live in Māhia. I live in the village of Nuhaka, which is about 25 k's west of the launch site. But one of the things that has been a driver for me, I guess, is the number of community and cultural impacts that have not been fully acknowledged by RocketLab, the company, by our local council, our regional council, and also the trustees administering the land block that have the lease with the company. So, but tonight I do have Joe with me, so I'm going to be introducing Joe in a minute, who's going to talk about some of the consent components. So that's a consent with the Wairau District Council, and that is because a lot of the questions that we get through the RocketLab Monitor Facebook page and the website is actually how is there legitimacy in a launch pad at Māhia? How did we arrive at this place? So I'm going to hand to Joe now, who's going to talk about the consents, and she's got a presentation here.
Yes, that's it. Okay. Oops, sorry. Kia ora koutou. I whakapapa back to rongo mai wahine, Tōhuru Marae. I live in Wairoa, but my whānau still live out at Māhia. I'm just sharing a little bit of information that a group of us have sort of put together. We contacted the Wairau District Council under the Official Information Act and requested information around the resource consent process for RocketLab, especially how it applied to tangata whenua. So they sent quite a few documents. They sent the report on what made it non-notifiable, the actual application, and then the policies that they have at the council when they come to working with tangata whenua and Māori. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that and some of the anomalies that we found in it. I'll just move to the first page. So when I got the reports back, one that was non-notifiable, on the conclusion of it, I've just shared it with you now, but the bit that got me was the 5.1, which was, in my opinion, the adverse environmental effects of the proposed activity are no more than minor. So when I looked, that then led me on to go and look at what is the section 95AF of the Act, of the Resource Management Act. When I went further to have a look, this is why they made it non-notifiable and they didn't have to consent with us. This is the main one that I sort of had. I thought, okay, in 95F, it's talking about the meaning of the affected protected customary rights group. That was a concern for me because I wanted to know who this customary rights group was that would have had to have given a written approval for the activity or withdraw their approval before it could be made non-notifiable. So I started digging around a bit and asking around. Nobody seems, what they're trying to say now is that the hapu from Tawapata South have made their own group that could give that customary rights. But as far as I know, the customary rights group out at Māhia is the Māhia Māori Committee, where we have all our permit holders for customary fishing. So I'm still delving into that to see how they could set up their own customary rights group as Tawapata, as an incorporation. We just were talking to someone yesterday who told us that's what they did. I approached the Māhia Māori Committee and they didn't give anything in writing. Because for me, and for us, it's about how they made it non-notifiable so they didn't have to consult. So that's one thing that we're looking into, but we can't seem to find any written approval for it to be, for the consent to go through. Another thing is when we looked at the report, they had a Māori relationships manager And in there it shows a direct quote. So that was questionable for us because there are many significant wahitapu areas within the catchment area that RocketLab have sectioned off when they have flights. One in particular is Waikawa, which is Portland Island. Waikawa is renowned for its whare wānanga and sacredness. When we look back into even the local song Roa Wharo, which has been around for decades, which was written by Tommy Todema, he talks about the sacredness of Waikawa. So, I mean, the Waiata that's sung nationally, they talk about it, but it wasn't recognised in this report. I know that there's another section in the resource management consent that talks about Indigenous fauna. We have a special karingo that grows only at Waikawa, that all our nannies, my nanny used to send my brother out to go and get her the karingo each time it was ready. So we do have all of those sacred places and traditions that our kaumātua can't have access to anymore. So those are all things that were not identified by the Māori Relationships Manager as being significant to Māori or our cultural practices. In the resource consent, this was all that they had about tangata whenua, that they looked at it as only being the people at Unanui Station not around. They discussed about having several meetings at Tuahuru and Kaiuku Marae. We have since spoken to the trustees of both of those marae, and their marae were used as venues to meet. That did not mean that they consented or agreed to it. RocketLab put it down in their consultation process that that's who they consulted with, but actually the consultation was only held there as a venue. Neither of the trustees at that marae gave their consent to what RocketLab were doing. So that is a huge point that the council made in their letter to me, to say that there were several meetings at Tuahuru and Kaiuku Marae as a part of the consultation process. When I asked the council, their response was there was no consultation with tangata whenua, and that best I approached the agency, but actually they're the consent authority, so it's actually their responsibility to hold it, not mine. Or it's not for me to go and ask RocketLab. They should be holding it because they gave the authority for the consent. So this was the only section that they had in the resource consent process about tangata whenua. Also in the report, when it came looking under Section 8, which was in the Resource Management Consent Act, it talks about Te Tiriti o Waitangi. They didn't identify any, and no matters relating to tangata whenua iwi had been identified. So as far as they were concerned, their Māori Relationships Officer didn't identify any of their cultural areas of significance for Māori, yet we go back to 2004, there was a coastal report where they talk about the whole of Māhia being a significant interest for cultural activities. One of the things that I think that what we wanted to talk about tonight mainly was about, in the resource consent report and the decision to make it non-notifiable, RocketLab has to hold a complaints register. All complaints have to be registered with RocketLab, and that they will then forward it on to the council. So when I contacted, I'm just going to flip to the next sheet, because I contacted Morgan, who is their spokesperson or media person, and I asked her to advise me that I was wanting to write a written complaint, and could she please tell me where do I write this complaint to, because I wanted to lodge it, but also have evidence that it had been lodged. And her response was that she also didn't know how to go about lodging a complaint, and suggested that I contact the council. My response was that it was written in the resource consent report, and I suggested that maybe she read it. But it also brought to our attention that maybe she hasn't looked at it. There have been no complaints. If they haven't got any complaints written to them, she doesn't know that there's a complaint register. that the more people that register complaints with RocketLab, they have to document that that was a part of a condition in the resource consent, that they hold this complaints register and that the council be notified of how they are problem solving any complaints. So that's what I was hoping, that we were hoping tonight, that you would all, our goal is to try and get as many people from as many organisations, or just to write complaints to RocketLab so that they have got registered complaints, because all of those have to be a part of the paperwork that follows. What we do also know is that in the report it said that we have 8 years to make a complaint. From 2015 there was 8 years that anybody had to complain about it. We're still, the more we go through the document, the more inaccuracies that we see. So we're still writing up a letter and sharing it. But when we do, the letter will be going to RocketLab, the council, Stuart Nash, all CC'd together, so that we know that everybody's aware of exactly, if we send a letter to RocketLab, we want confirmation that it's been lodged and to send that email back to us as proof that it has. So that's about what we wanted to share.
Thanks, Joe. So Joe's a member of Orongomai Wahine Whānau. So that's a tangata whenua group from Māhia. So kia ora, Joe. Thank you.
Kia ora.
Okay. Kia ora kōrua. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, very enlightening, and we'll work out ways to send daily letters of complaint, maybe, to RocketLab. I just now, my pleasure is to introduce Professor Kevin Clements. He's Emeritus Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago and Director of the Toda Peace Institute in Japan. He was the Foundation Chair of the Peace and Conflict Studies Centre and Director of the New Zealand Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago. He was also the Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and Foundation Director of the Australian Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Queensland. And he was also on the board of the European Centre for Conflict Prevention and a past president of the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office in Brussels. His latest book, Toward a Century of Peace, a dialogue on the role of civil society in peacebuilding, was written with Daisaku Ikeda and was published by Routledge in 2019. I see Daisaku is 93 years old and an amazing leader in Japan. So thank you very much, Kevin, for agreeing to share some of your insights with us. We look forward to your contributions now. Kia ora.
Kia ora mana, kia ora koutou. Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge all the wonderful work that Sonia and Joe and Manu, Liz and others are putting into this exploration of whether or not RocketLab is useful or not useful for New Zealand as a whole and for our national interests. You're doing wonderful work, and what I have to add is just sort of some additional bits and pieces which you've already covered to some extent in your slideshows, and you've covered also in your different contributions to thinking about RocketLab and the kinds of resistance we might make to it. So I have a little PowerPoint presentation, but one of the things which I wasn't able to do was to kind of follow. I had a whole series of things that we ought to be following. The first thing is, I think we need to be following the board and the decision makers, and I've prepared a little slide on that in the presentation. Secondly, I think we need to follow the money flows, because the RocketLab is, as Manu said, about to be floated on NASDAQ with highly inflated revenue expectations. the only way they can meet those revenue expectations is by forming closer and closer contacts with different parts of the Ministry of Defence. So following the money is something that somebody who's good at accountancy and good at following stock reports, everything else should be doing. Then thirdly, we need to follow the contractors. If you look at the Gunsmoke-J payload, which was put up a few weeks ago, Sandia Laboratories in the US were the ones that were responsible for most of its manufacturing, and they are a nuclear laboratory. And then, as we've all been doing, we need to follow the payloads in much more minute detail with the best possible physical expertise that we can get. And then we need to kind of follow and ask ourselves why the government is being so enthusiastic. Manu sort of already hinted at the fact that, you know, the government thinks that this is just brilliant and wonderful because it's bringing in new technology and so forth. But not all technology is good technology, and not all technology is in the interest of New Zealand. So anyway, they're my follows. Let me see if I can get my little PowerPoint up here. It's really not all that substantial, but compared to the ones that have been up there, but let me see if I can share it now. Can you see it all? Can you see it?
Yes, yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Is it?
No, now we can see your emails.
You can see my emails. All right. Oh gosh. Okay.
There we go. It's back again.
Okay. I'll just start the slideshow. Okay. So, I mean, the geopolitics of all of this, I mean, have to be seen in the context of New Zealand's peace movement's constant activity to kind of try and ensure that we're able to pursue a more or less independent and values-oriented foreign policy. And when you start looking at what's happening in RocketLab right now, it seems to contradict, and I'll get onto this later on, it certainly contradicts the Ngāia Mahuta's, you know, I thought very, very interesting and persuasive four Maori values, which she feels ought to be guiding our relationships. I like the photograph that Manu put off. It isn't rocket science. It is increasingly looking more and more like a US base. It looks like a US base. The people that are involved in it look like US contractors and defense contractors and venture capital companies that support US bases. The only thing that's missing are perimeter fences and either New Zealand military sentries or US military sentries. Increasingly, it's more and more like a military base. And I think that all of us need to be worried about it because it really does contradict our nuclear-free New Zealand. In the 1980s, when millions of us decided that we wanted to remove ourselves from extended deterrence and be nuclear-free, we were saying two things. One is we had no desire to be protected by nuclear weapons and ensured that neither weapons nor nuclear-powered warships went into New Zealand ports. And we wanted some clear separation from nuclear alliance networks so that we could pursue a more independent foreign policy. If you look at the polling from that time, some were happy to be a non-nuclear ally of the US. But if that weren't possible and it wasn't possible, then Kiwis gave a lot of weight to being nuclear-free rather than a full member of ANZUS. And because of that, as you know, we suffered all kinds of indignities at the hand of the US and our Australian neighbors. We had restricted intelligence flows. We weren't invited to joint military exercising and all of that stuff, all of which I think was a good thing because it did enable us to begin really asking some fundamental questions about our foreign policy stance, whether or not we could play an independent role within an alliance framework. And we certainly didn't want anything to do with any part of the Western nuclear triad. And so I think that, you know, front and center, as a number of people have been saying in relation to this lab, is the question of whether or not it infringes the letter of our anti-nuclear legislation, if not the law of the anti-nuclear legislation. And the PACT Act committee has written a very interesting letter, which Pauline and others have got right now, which is raising questions about those, whether or not it should be the Prime Minister rather than the Minister of Business and Industry and Enterprise that is making these kinds of decisions, and whether PACTAT ought to be advising it. And I think that, there's a kind of very strong argument to be made that we need some very strong civil society oversight with the best expertise that we can muster in relation to all of this if we're going to maintain a nuclear-free status, but more importantly, if we're going to ensure that we're not surreptitiously linked into any entangling connections which make us complicit in America's nuclear strategy. And I think that's exactly where this Rocket Lab is heading us. It's moving into very active support role to the US military and its Space Force. And as I've already said, that contradicts Māhia Aotearoa's value-based foreign policy. It, I think, really strikes at the heart of her desire that we start building up our foreign policy from connections with Indigenous peoples, and it, in fact, it begins to contradict what we all want to see, which is kind of higher levels of self-determination and independence in our foreign policy formulation. The justifications for Rocket Lab being primarily for research and technical purposes are contradicted by most of Rocket Lab's military payloads. When Phil Twyford was down here, for example, I kept on probing him on this question, and he said, well, as far as he was concerned, most of Rocket Lab's payloads have been primarily research and technologically oriented. But as I pointed out, that's really contradicted by any kind of cursory analysis of Rocket Lab's military payloads. His response was, well, most of those payloads are still exploratory. And then he brings in sort of the civilian uses of them for surveillance purposes and so forth. But the reality is that the red line that New Zealand has between utility for technical and technological purposes and for operational purposes, it really has been breached. And it's been breached with almost every launch. And the Gunsmoke-J launch, I think, was a particularly egregious example. He claims that was still largely a kind of a research enterprise, whereas it's very clear that the payload is delivering sort of real-time information to its owners and is enhancing US military targeting capacity, probably at a conventional level, but who knows, it could be at a nuclear level as well. Each rocket launch and each US military payload, I think, places it closer and closer to what Paul Buchanan calls the US kill line. If we send rockets into space, which can and will enhance US surveillance and targeting strategies, we're really complicit in their extrajudicial of terrorists and other undesirables by drone or precision bombing, and that's continuing. It started off with Barack Obama. It was continued by Donald Trump, and it's continuing by Joe Biden, who goes through every week. They have a sort of a kill list, and the US is beginning to get more and more accurate in terms of its ability to knock off different players that they find unacceptable. So Gunsmoke-J was directly related to that kind of very precision targeting. Secondly, if we have no control over the software guiding these ostensibly research satellites, we've got no way of knowing whether they're being made operational or not. I mean, they could be launched for technical purposes, and then with a software switch suddenly become operational and start guiding conventional and or nuclear weapons in operations over which we have no control. And it's playing a small but vital part in the militarization of space in the interests of the US Space Force. And I was also shocked to kind of see Māhia and others urging the development of a second rocket lab near Banks Peninsula as part of the sort of Artemis commitments. And again, it's being billed as an opportunity for New Zealand to get involved in a second launch program that will be critical in shooting people off to the moon and Mars and goodness knows where. But primarily, this is about space domination. And I think that's something which, again, ties us more closely to US military purposes. Now, if you look at the, sorry, I haven't had a chance to sort of really go through. I started looking at some of the financial links, incidentally, and I mean, I'm sure accountants will do a much better job of it than I, but I was really kind of shocked to sort of, if you start tracking back the companies that are associated with paying for Rocket Lab, they go straight to the heart of the military industrial complex. And if you look at Rocket Lab's board of directors, which is from their own website, I mean, if you look at this is the board, Peter Beck has got very strong links to the Pentagon, and as Manu said, you know, Rocket Lab is basically all about defense. Mike Griffin is on the board of directors. He's an American former Undersecretary of Defense. He was head of the Missile Defense Agency and the Defense Innovation Unit in Defense. I mean, he's somebody who is deeply, deeply complicit in missile technology for nuclear and non-nuclear purposes. Sven Strohand is an American financier. All of these guys have got very strong links to Silicon Valley and so forth. David Cohen is another American expert on cybersecurity. Mac Ocko is an American specialist on cybersecurity and national defense. And there's only one Kiwi on the list. So this is a bit like a Sharif psychological experiment. You could imagine that even if Peter Beck had a strong desire to ensure that Rocket Lab's payloads were only technical and for research purposes, I mean, his 4 other members of the board would be able to kind of persuade him that there was indeed a kind of a moving light when the light was standing still. And in the event, he's demonstrated by his behavior that he doesn't resist Pentagon contracts. On the contrary, they need more and more Pentagon contracts to justify the kind of $4 billion revenue flow which they anticipate for this public launch. And then if you look at the executive leadership, I mean, there are 9 people there. Peter Beck is Kiwi. Adam Spice is the chief financial advisor, ex-Max Linear software firm. Sean O'Donnell is a Kiwi, but in charge of global operations, and he's been deeply embroiled in American missile assistance. Lars Hossmann, he's the American senior vice president. He used to work for SpaceX, National Security Space Strategy, ex-US Air Force, ex-Pentagon. Shane Fleming, American VP, was an ex-Lanzatech, very close connection to Silicon Valley again. Lachlan Matchett is a Kiwi who's in charge of propulsion. Sean DeMello is Australia with strong connections to American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Richard French, American Director of Business Development Strategies from NASA. Islam Mosley is American Space Systems Chief Engineer, ex-TVAC Nano Satellite Systems. And if you start looking at their connections, they go back into many, many other military agencies. So there are only 3 Kiwis out of 9 in the executive leadership. And all the Americans have close links to Silicon Valley and the US military industrial complex. And so do the Kiwis as well. So being Kiwi national in this environment doesn't actually make you more independent. So I think we need to kind of be aware of the fact, and you know, what we need to start building up are the connections that people have with others who are right at the heart of the military establishment in the US. None of the board or executive leadership, I think, are primarily motivated by New Zealand's interests. On a basis of past work experience, technical expertise, it's difficult for Rocket Lab to argue that its senior leadership exists to serve the interests of Māhia, Auckland, or Aotearoa, New Zealand. Their interests lie in securing lucrative US defense contracts to justify their revenue announcements for the public flow to NASDAQ. And on the basis of their published statements and past careers, few of the top team are interested in safeguarding a nuclear-free New Zealand or promoting civilian research, technological rockets. The company is by and large now an American one, which thrives or not on the basis of US defense contracts, thereby sucking New Zealand further into the American military machine. As one of only 9 rocket launching countries in the world, I mean, there's no doubt at all that, you know, in some future major international conflict, which is difficult to see right now, New Zealand would become a target, especially if we are lined up in the American line of battle. Anyone can see that payloads on Rocket Lab's rockets are primarily for US military purposes. And in the event of any future conflict, we'll be identified as a strong American ally, even if we're, largely out of ANZUS. We'll be seen as providing a base for US military R&D and probably eventually a large number of operational satellites. So it seems to me we're being reincorporated into the American military machine by stealth. And this isn't okay if we wish to pursue a values-based foreign policy, are interested in a rules-based political order, want to prevent the militarization of space, and more importantly, if we're wanting to kind of be an independent country making up our own minds, and ensuring a lot of blue water between us and non-nuclear states that are aligned so closely with the US in terms of extended deterrence strategies. So in terms of next steps, I think in addition to what Manu said, we need a national debate about the benefits of Rocket Lab to New Zealand. Just as we did with Waihopai and the other spy bases and the under Five Eyes. I think that New Zealanders really need to kind of have a good solid public debate about this so that we can ask ourselves, do we want to be stealthily reinserted into the American military industrial complex, probably in a much more closely integrated fashion than was the case when we were objecting so strongly to nuclear powered and nuclear armed warships. If New Zealanders as a whole see few benefits and many costs, I think the enterprise should be closed. If the government won't do this, and they seem to be enthralled to this whole notion that somehow or other we're on the cutting edge of space technology and exploration of space and pioneering, outer galaxies and all this kind of stuff. If they're not willing to close it, then I think we really do need to work to make sure the Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Act review receives as many submissions as possible, submissions that are aimed at tightening its provisions, making sure that whoever is supervising and reviewing and authorizing payloads are not wittingly or unwittingly contradicting our anti-nuclear stance. I think we need to empower PACTAC as our primary civil society watchdog on approval processes. I think the New Zealand Prime Minister, rather than the Minister of MBI, should decide on whether payloads are malign or not and conform with our anti-nuclear legislation. And all of us, I think, need to be wary of entangling nuclear and conventional alliances. We've got to insist on absolutely clear separation between our national defense priorities and those of the US. Our political interests aren't served by serving the Pentagon and its affiliates. So for my money, I think we should close down the whole operation before we're sucked into activities that contradict our values-based foreign policy and our anti-nuclear legislation. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kevin. A lot to take in, and we will have question and answers. Hopefully there'll be some questions come through. One actually was for those that don't know, you suggested that PACTAC should be our primary watchdog. Can you explain what PACTAC is?
The Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control, does have a kind of a supervisory role in law on arms control and disarmament issues. And it has a primary purpose of making sure that the anti-nuclear legislation is upheld. So it's really crucial, it's really crucial that we have good people on PACTAC and that it's reporting to the Minister of Arms Control and Disarmament, Phil Twyford, but that it also has some mechanism for ensuring direct links to the Prime Minister if it looks as though there are some major infringements of our anti-nuclear legislation.
And these are civilian citizens rather than politicians on this committee?
Civilian citizens. Wayne Mapp is the deputy chair. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. Have we got some questions? Just looking. In the meantime, we might pass over to Laurie Ross, who's a spokesperson for New Zealand Nuclear-Free Peacemaking, which her father, Larry Ross established in 1981. Laurie's been working for 4 decades on New Zealand peacekeeping, defence and foreign policy to help prevent militarisation and warfare. Laurie, are you there?
Okay, thank you so much, Manu and Sonia and Kevin, Clements and Aliana, who's been putting together this whole Zoom program. My main role is, at the present time, as coordinator of the events for the stopping of the militarization of space. And the particular event that I'm focused on at the moment is the first Auckland protest. And it will be outside of the RocketLab headquarters at 25 Levine Place in Mount Wellington. So this is really our first opportunity in Auckland to really put the laser light, as it were, on the nerve center of RocketLab, in which over 100 people are employed, and they're making new rockets, and they're actually controlling what happens at the Māhia launch pad. So it's very important that we make a presence there, even though many of us have conducted in-depth correspondence with the ministers over the last year. We realize again that the ministers, the politicians, need to see people on the ground. And I'm pleased to be able to inform you that the media are interested. So that's why I'm looking at that 21st of June, that's Monday, noon, 21st of June. So it's winter solstice, shortest day, longest night, but we'll just be there for that intense hour where we have our banners right under the RocketLab logo. And the banners will say no militarization of space, keep space for peace, etc. And the RocketLab people will be coming out at midday for their lunch. And they're really nice to talk to because I've been there several times. And many of them say they didn't know about how RocketLab is being used for the US Space Missile Defense Command warfare combat targeting. And they said they're not supposed to know. But the important thing is that if we're going to put any blocks or restraints on the military industrial complex, then we need to make a collective stand and we need to help engage the workers. So I'm pleased to say that Mike Treen from the Unite Union in Auckland, who's again a veteran activist like myself, will be coming along with the sound systems and so on, and his team. And then I've also got the Kaumatua co-president of First Union, Sid Kipa, who will also be opening our gathering on the 21st of June. And it's now the time of Matariki. So Matariki, we're honoring the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades, the stars. And so we're realizing how precious space in the night sky is. And I've been in contact with my local board, Waitaki Ranges local board, and there's 21 local boards in Auckland, and each of them need to be lobbied, just as we did for the Nuclear Free New Zealand campaign. We have to lobby them. But my own local board is very keen, that we do this because they want to protect the night sky too. So there's many reasons, although we have been focused on the stopping of the militarization. So what I've done is I've organized for a meeting with Peter Beck, the CEO of RocketLab, and for him to meet with Peter Wills, who's in the physics department of Auckland University, along with Matt Robson, who is the former Minister for Disarmament in the 1990s of our New Zealand government, but also he's currently with the Peace Foundation International Affairs and Disarmament Committee, which I'm on as well. So we will have a good little spearhead or delegation. Plus, I'm hoping, I'm not expecting too many people to take time off work or off school, but I know some will do that, and they'll bring their guitars and they'll be singing. And so it will be you could say a traditional New Zealand peace activist protest. and it will be full of aroha for the land, because we want to protect this beautiful land of Aotearoa with our love, with our aroha. And we want to protect space. We want to protect the heavens, Papatuanuku and Rangi. We want to protect them, and we want to help all of humanity to wake up to the beauty of this earth and to do what is required to stop the militarization. And so let's, again, we just have to start with ourselves, with Aotearoa, and make that stand to keep space for peace. And I invite you to come along, especially if you're in Auckland, even though it's a bit of a pilgrimage to get out to Monterey, that's Mount Wellington, but it's well worth the effort to come out there and just be part of that kaupapa. So thank you so much for this meeting tonight, and tell anyone you know in Auckland to just come along, make a stand just for an hour on the winter solstice, and just convey that message to our government and to the public and through the media, because the media will be there. Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Laurie. There was one question about whether the meeting with Peter Beck would be recorded. I'm assuming not, but just wanted you to confirm one way or the other on it.
I don't know. I haven't got confirmation that he's willing. I've said even 10 minutes would be, because he's a busy man. Naturally, we're all busy. But do you think it's a good idea to have that recorded? And should we ask for that? The media would love it if they could.
It would be great, but I suspect he'll say no, and it might be better to focus on the relationship building initially, rather than, getting no meeting because he doesn't want to record it. Or you could ask and he can say no, and you can say that's fine. Either way, leave that with you.
I'd be inclined to go for a relationship building exercise at the moment. Gather as much information as you can.
Yep. No doubt he'll be watching this, or certainly his comms people will be, so they'll let him know. We've got a few more questions here. Excuse my fingers, just got to get to the chat. One was, why is the Prime Minister, do you think, passing on responsibility to the Minister for Disarmament, Phil Twyford, on this?
Well, I think she doesn't want to sort of be preoccupied with it and wants him to sort of take the heat on it. But he's not in cabinet, so he's out of cabinet. So I think that's kind of a slightly problematic. I think in terms of New Zealand's nuclear-free legislation, it's the Prime Minister that ought to have full responsibility for ensuring that we're in compliance. So, I think that's something we should just keep pushing.
And Phil Twyford was responsible for drafting the cabinet principles around the payloads in 2019. Is that right? When he was Minister for Economic?
He was.
Yeah. I think it's interesting the point you raised too of Nanaya's talking about the principles of kaitiakitanga as our sort of core values in terms of our activities as a nation in relation to space and having a kaitiaki role in space. I struggle to see how sort of supporting weapons development in space is connected to that, but that'll be an interesting conversation to have with her at some point in the near future. Another question was, what do you think the New Zealand government get out of supporting RocketLab directly or indirectly, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think this is sort of just one of these sort of almost like childlike obsessions with, the space frontier and technology associated with it, and the fact that we're on the sort of cutting edge of rocket technology, which is identical to missile technology, and I think this is just a sort of a kind of a certain cognitive blindness on the part of our government in relation to this at the moment. It's just assumed to be a good because of the income that is projected and because of the ostensible numbers of jobs it's creating. Yeah, I don't know. We weren't in New Zealand when this sort of first came up.
There was another question about the recent disclosures of Rocket Lab's employment practices and a court decision that was considered by a number of commentators as one of the most serious breaches of New Zealand employment law and their own employment agreements with the employee in question. And I see Rocket Lab's been in the news in the last couple of days as well for the millions of dollars in wage subsidy that they received while making a significant profit, much higher than the loss that they'd made the previous year. So I think that was disclosed in their recent financials, and there's some questions over whether they should be and intend to pay back the wage subsidy that they took from the government. So yeah, there's a few issues going on for the company at the moment. Another question there. So the 1987 nuclear-free legislation doesn't effectively implement Aotearoa's obligations under the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The Rocket Lab payloads are now creating questions about Aotearoa's compliance with the Nuclear Ban Treaty. That treaty's compliance mechanisms could be instituted if we don't get satisfaction from our own government in sorting this out. Do you think that's a realistic path?
I think that's a lovely suggestion, Andrew, and certainly in terms of the TPNW, that's a much stronger, in a way, that's a much stronger kind of prohibition than in our anti-nuclear legislation. Yeah, I think that we ought to be kind of hammering our obligations under that treaty.
And what's the mechanism for pursuing that?
Well, when it comes into force, there's a review conference which will be held in January next year. So we need to make sure that our government is doing all it can to ensure that it's in compliance, that we're doing what we can to kind of promote the abolition of nuclear weapons altogether, and that we're, and again, there's sort of another interesting dynamic between the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is that, you know, the TPNW is much more radical than the NPT, which it just creates a kind of a permanent series of nuclear powers and a permanent series of non-nuclear powers, but doesn't do anything to really delegitimate the nuclear powers possession or threatened use of such weapons.
Okay, I think we're getting close to, we're just past 8 o'clock. We'd said we'd go 7 to 8, I think. Kevin, there were some questions about your list of suggested next steps or what we can do, actions and things. And what we might do is sort of take those and put them into a bit of an action plan or give people some ideas, and we'll share that through Auckland Peace Action and the RocketLab Monitor Facebook group and website, so that people can follow up on some of those great suggestions that you had there.
Good.
Unless there's anything else, there's a few more questions and comments coming in, and we could just, for those that want to stay online, can do so, and can continue the conversation perhaps, but I'll draw the formal part of the session to an end. And again, thank our presenters, both in Māhia and Dunedin, and Auckland Peace Action for organising all of this logistics. And don't forget the 21st of June, Monday at midday outside Rocket Lab in Mount Wellington, if you'd like to come and make your voice heard there. Otherwise, there's lots of other ways to raise voice and concerns. And thank you all for attending tonight. Hopefully it's been useful. This recording will be saved and shared, I'm sure, so you can pass it on to others that may have missed it this evening. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you. Kia ora.